Let's kick off then. Welcome everyone to session 3 in our series of 6 sessions about leading in complex times. I'm Mike Vesey. I'm coming to you with shaved head and from a very sunny part of Austria this morning. You're all very welcome and I hope you're all safe and well. In session 3, we're reverting back to a more cognitive or conceptual theme for navigating complexity. We've got quite a lot of content for you today. The slides will be available as per usual on the website, but it is quite a heavy session content-wise, so buckle up. Similar format to how we've run these sessions before, 30 minutes from me to do a bit of positioning, and we'll introduce a tool for you to take away to apply to a problem or an issue that you might be grappling with right now. And then today's second part, the digestive session, is being led by my friend and colleague Karen Ellis. Thank you, Karen, who's been immensely helpful in terms of putting together today's session, as has her partner Matt. Thank you. I'll reveal that a bit later. And in the second part, if you are able to stay on for that, it's a slightly different format led by Karen. She will be drawing from some of the ideas of the newer sciences to help develop some of your lenses for how you might look at your own world and make sense of things, very much continuing in the vein that Julia started with, a metaphorical and a poetic way of helping us to apply these ideas in the real world. So welcome to this session about complex or non-linear causality. And that's a picture that I took literally a few days ago. So spring is gradually arriving here. The intent of this session then, we are going to make a link back to the Cynefin framework that we looked at in session 1. Don't worry if you haven't seen session 1. You don't need that as a prerequisite for joining today. But to draw make the point about navigating complexity requires a different approach or a different mindset to when we might be operating or finding ourselves in more complicated environments. And we'll offer a tool for you to take away to make sufficient sense of what might be going on in complexity in order that you can take some action. The analogy I often use when using this tool with individuals is to see more of the mountain and yet still be able to take the first step. So a quick refresher of the Cynefin framework. On the right-hand side, we have got the predictable world, a world that many of us have grown up in, or we think we've grown up in, which is more known and ordered and linear, where cause and effect are largely known, patternable and repeatable. And on the left-hand side, we have the unpredictable world, where the relationship between cause and effect are not discernible. And the Cynefin framework has 4 domains within it. Within obvious, the pattern between cause and effect is bleedingly obvious almost. It's clear to most people and therefore it's shared amongst large groups of people. In the complicated domain, a little bit of separation in time and space here. This is the world of experts who can usually piece together what is causing what. But when we move over into the unpredictable world, in the chaotic domain, we have no sense of what is going on at all. And in the complex domain, the relationship is certainly very blurred or very fuzzy. We might not see it until after the event, if at all. And therefore, we also get interpersonal disagreements about what is going on and what is the right action to take. In session 1, we talked a bit more detail as to how you might use this framework then for determining what is the nature of the problem or issue that I'm facing right now, and what is the potential response that I might take. And some suggestions are there on the screen. So on the right-hand side, where cause and effect are largely known, this is the certain domain. We can predict because causality is largely known to us, and therefore we can move forward with some degree of certainty. Today, I'd like to take you into the complex domain on the unpredictable side, a non-linear world where we're not sure what is causing what, and therefore we need to scan, experiment, and tread much more lightly. So that's the framing for today's session. How do we navigate situations which we might discern are more complex rather than complicated? And so today's theme is thinking through complexity. And we'll look at how we might shift from a complicated or analytical or linear paradigm, a way of thinking about the world, to a paradigm of navigating with complexity. And why do paradigms matter? Well, paradigms inform how we see the world, and they also inform what we see and what we do not see. And it seemed appropriate there at Easter to have a paradigm shift of the egg to the chick there. So that is the shift in mindset that this session is particularly speaking to, and that Karen and I have some insights to share with you. If we just look at that paradigm shift then, and I'm simplifying for effect here, on the left-hand side, you've got what we've called a linear or an analytical paradigm. So this is the world that largely draws originally from Greek philosophy of rationalism, but particularly came to the fore during the Enlightenment. So this is a world of technological or mechanical, of rational, of objective understanding. The idea that we can seek out a single version of the truth and that there is a universally accepted objective version of the truth. And this way of thinking, of course, gave rise to many of the technological advances of the 19th and 20th century. It gave us the steam engine, the sewerage system, it gave us electricity, it also gave us the combustion engine, and of course, the makers of the modern car never foresaw the unintended environmental consequences of creating some of this technology. In the organizational world, this is the world of Taylorism, of mass production, of Henry Ford, of organizing things in a very scientific or rational type of way. In politics, we can see this in philosophers like Marx. On the right-hand side of the screen, we've got a brief description of what we might mean by a complexity paradigm here. So this is a world of much smaller elements combining to form a whole. This is a world of atoms and subatomic particles. This is a world of microbes making up fungal structures and leaves and trees and squirrels. These are organisms in a wider ecosystem. Here, particular philosophers or scientists we might turn to would include Einstein and Heisenberg. And if we make the transition into the organizational world as well, here are thinkers including Senge, Sharma, Stacey, and Snowden. And in the organizational setting, these thinkers are looking at how actors or agents, i.e. people, you and me, might interact within a system like atoms colliding with one another to cause various effects over time. In part two, Karen is going to say a bit more about some of the underlying assumptions behind these two paradigms, but I just wanted to leave them there for now so you're aware of the domain that we're working in. And I'm really going to be now talking about the shift between looking at things in a very static way to looking at more dynamic or complex causality. And we're going to do that, having had that brief introduction, by looking at a tool which we call a multiple cause diagram, or in an example that I'm going to show you from the Lancet Medical Journal, they've called it a causal loop diagram. We're using those two terms interchangeably. Now, one of the features around working with complex causality or dynamic causality is that multiple causes can have the same given effect. Effects can also loop back and become causes. Cause and effect might be separated by time and delay, and that's one of the issues with the COVID pandemic, that there is a time delay with which people might be asymptomatic before they acquire symptoms and before they realize they have the disease. Many causes in a dynamic situation are invisible or unknowable. We might be able to see them post hoc with the benefit of hindsight. Sometimes we never even know what is causing what. So these are some of the characteristics in a dynamic causal system. So turning to the tool itself then, why do we think this is a useful tool and why have we suggested we introduce you to it today? Multiple cause diagrams are really useful to help us look at a wider system as to what is going on. And they can trace a sequence of cause and effect through a situation or through a system. And when developing a diagram of your own, it's important to remember this is your perspective on the issue, and a colleague or a partner may have a very different diagram even with the same variables. So it's often quite a useful technique for both clarifying and illuminating your own thinking, but then sharing with a team that you might be working with, and therefore drawing out a range of different hypotheses about what might be going on and therefore what interventions or experiments we might make. So it's really useful for clarifying your own thinking, looking at your own perspective, but then also sharing that with others. It's super helpful for identifying potential feedback loops or reinforcing cycles within a system, which might either be having an amplifying or a de-amplifying effect. And those feedback loops, as we'll see in a minute, are really useful points to interrogate in a diagram or a system to think, what might we do with the insights that we gain? And when I use this tool, either working one-to-one with coaches or with executive teams or on a program, I often find that developing the tool in and of itself is a really useful mind-opening way of working on a problem. So let's have a look at how we might create a multiple cause diagram. So the first thing you need to do is think, well, what is my event or state? What is the problem that I'm trying to interrogate via this tool? Then I suggest what you want to do is get a pack of Post-it notes. And here's one I did earlier over the weekend as I was preparing for today's situation, and think, what are the potential factors that might be causing this particular event or state? And if you just generate free form to begin with, anything from 15 to 20 items, that gives you a good start level in terms of a workable level of detail. And one of the other things there you could see in bullet 5, I think it is, to bear in mind, think about if a factor is causal, it needs to kind of have a verb in there, something that is increasing your event or state or decreasing, or it's creating the situation. And the benefit of using Post-its to begin with is you can then start to move them around and pattern your thinking as it takes shape in quite an iterative sort of way. I was doing it on the dining table over the weekend, but you can use a wall, a flip chart, whatever resources you've got around you right now. So let's have an example that might be familiar to some of us more from the corporate world by way of illustration first. So someone has identified that call center wait times have increased. And what do we do in best managerial fashion? Someone has decided to set some targets for the people who are taking the calls. What then happens is that gets embedded into the performance management system and the way that we manage the call center staff. So supervisors put pressure on people to hit the targets. What gets measured gets done. We know the adages. And then for what happens, this is when we start to see some unintended consequences, because call times are cut to deal with more customers. Fewer issues are actually resolved on the call itself, resulting in customers ringing back to satisfy the reason that they phoned in the first place. That causes the amount of rework to rise, which in turn causes wait times to increase. So first of all, we can see quite a simple loop there, some unintended consequences from setting targets for the call center staff. So short-term actions, when we don't look beyond the end of our nose, often have unintended consequences. The real use of a multiple cause diagram is to peel back the layers of an onion of a problem. And maybe when we looked at this problem in a little more detail, that we found actually one of the reasons why call center wait times have increased is more customers were calling in for the first time, because product X that we launched had several faults. And product Y was actually performing quite successful with a sales launch, and therefore more people were calling in to the call center. We can also start to peel back the layers of the onion a little more and look at what are the consequences of supervisors putting pressure on operatives or staff, and see that staff morale drops, often a lag measure if we're using things like staff surveys, etc. That in turn leads to a rise in attrition. People actually leave the job. We have to recruit more staff. We have to train more staff, which means we've got less staff available to take calls in the first place. So you can see from this very simple illustration how a very simple loop to begin with, which was exacerbating the problem, the more that we peel back the layers here, we can start to see a little more as to what might be going on here. And I think the underlying message here for any of us who are tempted to knee-jerk managerial actions is often, if we fail to understand the real causality, often the solutions we put in place can exacerbate the problem. And that's the problem with much of managerial thinking in the modern era. So in planning for today, I thought, well, let's see if we can develop a multiple cause diagram for the COVID-19 pandemic. It seemed very topical and something that would resonate with many people on this call. So that was my start point or my event. How could we cope with this better in the future? And I spent the weekend identifying a number of different factors and building up my pack of Post-it notes. Not least that this is a novel experience, and certainly for many of us in the West, we haven't experienced this kind of pandemic in living lifetime. If you're in certain East Asian countries, of course, they have experienced SARS and other pandemics before, so it's not quite so novel. But for most of us, or many of us in Western Europe, this is a novel experience. Having started this this multiple cause diagram and scratching my head as I was trying to place these all over the dining table, I give thanks here to Karen's partner, who said actually the Lancet Medical magazine, a publication, has actually already developed a multiple cause diagram or a causal loop diagram on the current pandemic. So I put my Post-it notes to one side there, and I thought, well, let's have a look at what the Lancet has actually produced. And here I'll guide you through the diagram that they have put together. So in the first instance, we have people who are infectious, and we have people who have not yet had the virus. That seemed a common start point. Those that are infectious start to contaminate the environment around them through coughing and sneezing, etc. And that creates the risk then of transmission from one group of people who have the virus to people who do not yet have the virus. And that creates what in the Lancet terms they have called transmission events. So transmission events can occur on public transport, which is why that's been shut down. It seems to have happened a lot in après ski bars in the couple of valleys over from me. It's happened at the Cheltenham Festival in the UK, and it happened at Carnival in Köln and various other European cities as well. So we can already start to see how the virus is transmitted from people with the virus to people who have not yet had it. As we start to build the picture then, the number of infectious people starts to drive up the number of cases detected and that are reported, and the perceived number of infectious people that then might be in the general population. And that itself starts to drive public perception. And a large part of what policymakers are doing in terms of managing the current pandemic is to manage public perception. So as the number of infectious people rise, and the media is showing all sorts of graphs daily and updating these almost by the minute in terms of number of cases and sadly number of deaths, so public opinion, public perception is heightened. And we can see the positive arrows there, meaning increasing or heightened. And as public perception is heightened, then of course the perception drives the efficacy of some of the lockdown measures, that people start to take it more seriously. Not all, but some start to take it more seriously. And that in turn, that perception then really starts to drive the policies that policymakers are putting in place to lock down and reduce the number or frequency of interpersonal contacts that we have, which in itself you can see leads back to the number of transmission events. Now, these are two factors that have no arrows going into them on the Lancet model, so these seem to be originating factors. As I mentioned earlier, there's something in the West about this is a novel scenario we find ourselves in, and therefore the sense of how the public will react to that environment is largely unknown, which is why policymakers are experimenting with juggling between how much shock and awe to give to the public versus not creating a sense of panic. We also have an originating item there in the bottom right in terms of the accountability of authorities, which state actors have indeed been acting swiftly and which haven't. And we've seen quite different responses from different government actors, which is in turn playing out in terms of the trust that the public have in certain authorities. Some people's perceptions of their trust is going through the roof, and some are being sorely questioned, which in itself then starts to lead back to public perceptions of the measures that government and state actors are taking. And then, by no means last, then we've got public outrage driving stigma in terms of how the disease is perceived, which then also link back to the number of cases that might be detected. So you can see how from our post-it notes, we can start to arrange these in a sense or semblance of what is going on here. And if you're asking why are there pluses and minuses on this diagram here, the pluses show an increasing effect of this particular factor on the factor it then drives, or the minuses show a decrease. But if we just put those to that factor to one side for a moment. So what do we actually do then with this diagram, and how might you use this if you're creating one of your own for an organizational problem? There are several things that you might want to look at by way of interrogating your diagram. Number one is to look at pivotal items in the diagram. That would be one indicated by lots of arrows going into a box or a bucket, or lots coming out. Are there originating items? These would be boxes or post-its only with arrows leaving them. And are there any feedback loops that you see that could be influenced or fiddled with as a way of influencing how the system is behaving? So if we look at the version that the Lancet published, we can see there already in red, there is a primary feedback loop there. The number of infectious people driving the risk of transmission from interpersonal contact, driving the number of transmission events. And if you see transmission events, then leading to ever greater number of infectious people. The bar or the equal sign there is indicating that there is a slight delay between transmission events, people catching the virus, and the number of infectious people. And that delay is often one of the problems with complex or dynamic causality. Because we can't see something straight away, we're confused as to what might be going on. So that's what that is indicating there, that bar. And it's because of that primary loop there that policymakers have been particularly focusing on taking action in that space first to break or slow down that loop that you can see there. I've marked out a balancing loop there in the top left there. So this is the idea that fewer susceptible people leads to less transmission. So again, that is around all of the social distancing measures that we've been taking. It's the idea of herd immunity as well. The more people that have got the virus, there are less people that are susceptible to eventually getting the virus, and therefore we reduce transmission events as well. So first of all, we can start to look at loops in our system, and there are some other loops which I'm going to skip over in the interest of time. Secondly, we might interrogate the diagram for a number of things that we've put across the bottom here. So originating items or starting conditions, the novelty, and therefore we don't know how the public are going to react, is really important in terms of driving the sense of public outrage or public perception about the pandemic and how it's being handled. That is an item with only arrows coming out of it. Equally, the accountability of authorities, those that have more stepped up to the plate or others who've said, didn't know anything about this, is also driving trust in authorities. So those are two originating items on our diagram here. We've marked out something called a real world pivot point there, and you can see that is around transmission events. And therefore, why have we marked that out? Because that is something that you would really want to focus on in terms of managing, because it's quite central to the causality of the diagram and the risk of more people acquiring infection. The other thing in this particular diagram that seemed worthy of calling out is what we've called psychological pivot points. So public perceived risk, the perception of infected people, the perception of the effectiveness of measures, and a double triangle around public outrage, because this is what governments are really trying to do here. They are trying to manage public perception sufficiently that people act and take this seriously, but not to panic people. So this juggling or titration act of just trying to get the messaging quite right with people. And then finally, before I finish with this diagram, because I'm a little bit over time, one of the other things that we can see then with dynamic or complex causality is potentially some loops that we hadn't seen in the first place. So the red loop was immediately apparent to many people, and that's why policymakers started to tackle that straight on. But you can see there's another, what we have called potentially oscillating loop, i.e. it can go both ways. It might accelerate something in our map, but equally might slow it down. So if I just walk through that very quickly, the perceived number of infectious people that you can see in the middle is driving the effectiveness of policies to reduce interpersonal contacts. And that is having there's a delay there, another equal sign, but that is increasing then the number of and effectiveness of policies to reduce contact. As more and more people are perceived to be infective, governments increasingly tightened up the regime of lockdown. That had an impact on the frequency of interpersonal contacts, which drives the number of transmission events, and therefore the number of transmission events decreases. That then, in turn, leads to a decrease in the number of infectious people and the number of cases detected, which would then drive a perceived decrease in the number of infectious people, and therefore would change policymakers' decisions. And therefore, the timing for when we start to reduce some of the social distancing and lockdown measures becomes really key, because if the perception that the number of infectious people is going down, it's driving lower transmission, we might take our foot off the brake in terms of the policy formulation, and then that might accelerate then a second or third round of new cases. So I've used the example of the pandemic there to show you a causal loop or a multiple cause diagram. But in your day jobs, and when I work with clients in organizational or corporate settings, clients have used this type of technology or tool for things like the introduction of the sugar tax in an FMCG company, product innovation, meeting structures that were or not working within a corporate setting, managing trade union relationships during a period of change, or sales, perhaps product sales, service sales during the current pandemic. So I hope that's given you a useful tool to take away that you might use for yourselves. The slides are on the NDV website, and you might want to have a think about how might I use this back at the ranch with my colleagues? How might we share this tool in terms of illuminating or examining maybe a long-standing or systemic problem that you've been facing? The resources are there on our website, or if you'd like to know more, you can get in touch with me personally. Over to you, Karen.
Those of you who've been in the digestive sessions before with Julie will know that she's taking a very sort of poetical and metaphorical perspective on the content of the first half of the session. I'm going to do something slightly different, which is draw on science. And those of you who are interested in scientific paradigms, hopefully this will be a little canter through some ideas from the new sciences of complexity theory, chaos theory, deep ecology, and so on. It will only be a canter. You could probably spend a week talking about these different sciences. But one of the reasons we thought it might be of interest to people is because when you have a new paradigm, of course, you have a whole new set of lenses to look at the world. And my contention would be that most of our organizational thinking at the moment, in most cases, is still stuck in a paradigm which science left probably 60 or 70 years ago. And a lot of people are not aware of that. And it drives different behaviors and different ways of analyzing situations which actually aren't suited to the human environment at all. So I'm going to talk about 5 lenses that come out of the new sciences, and Mike is going to have to drive the slides for me. So I'm going to do that a lot. So carry on, Mike. So Mike mentioned right at the beginning of the session that the science of modernity is really the foundation of the fabric of modern technological, particularly Western capitalist life. Newton came along, Kepler came along, massive bridges between countries came along, solar farms came along, and for some reason we decided to put people on the moon, which you know, you can have an attitude or an opinion about that. We're not knocking the science of modernity. It's given many of us a fantastic lifestyle. It's allowed us to control things in some ways that we haven't been able to control before. But at the same time, those of you who pay attention to much of what's going on in the world at the moment will know it's also driven some very deleterious adverse consequences, particularly for the environment and for a huge proportion of the world's population. So modernity is a good thing, and it has limitations. So what happens if we look at the world from a different paradigm, one that comes out of the new sciences? So this slide sort of illustrates some of the key sciences that arose from the middle part of the 20th century: quantum physics, string theory, chaos theory. The one on the left is the whole new technology of biomimicry. And I think there's one more, Mike. And also the whole set of biological sciences around deep ecology. Again, those of you who have paid any attention to your history books will know that there's a degree of novelty about this science. That's why there's a question mark. But also, some of these ideas are not so new. So if you are familiar with the Tao Te Ching, or with the idea of the green man from Celtic philosophy, or Heraclitus from Greek philosophy, or even the activities of tribal peoples like the Karen, no pun intended, who created these beautiful rice paddies, actually we've understood as humans for millennia that the world is a complex place, and trying to break it up into an analytical frame may not serve us in many cases. So if we were to take the core lessons from complexity science and chaos theory and some of these other new sciences, what would it tell us? It would move us away from the ideas on the left-hand side of this slide, linear causality, paying loads of attention to entities and things, looking at stable order, smooth progressions, trying to be efficient all the time, and really believing in objective understanding of reality, into something actually, obviously, much more complex. So Mike was spent the last half an hour talking us through this idea of multiple causality, which comes from system thinking, but also we would start to pay attention to interactions rather than things. We would think our outcomes are to do with relationships, not just to do with the entities involved. We'd start to focus on things like disequilibrium and emergence, which I'll come back to in a moment. We'd start to think about diversity and how important that is in resilience, and also the importance of subjective understanding of reality, which drives a lot of human behaviour. So as I go through these 5 lenses, what I'd like you to do is have a think about something that you're interested in that is genuinely complex. So that could be an interest in climate change, it could be an interest in inequality in society, it could be about the rise of nationalism, it could even be about something to do with your own industry. And I'd like you to take these lenses and apply them to that particular problem as we go along and see if it shows you anything new. So the first thing we're going to look at is this idea of complex causality, which Mike's already taken us through so elegantly. Good job, Mike. And think about how that might be applied in a scientific and human setting. So what we're doing when we're looking at complex causality is looking at patterns of coherence or incoherence that form, and recognizing that those patterns can be radically unpredictable. So I've got a picture of the surf interacting into a very particular coherent pattern on a beach. I've got the impacts of global warming on there, and that bottom picture is what happens when you introduce a beaver back into a river system that had died, and how quickly one small tipping point can actually change things into a different form. So complex causality is one of our first indicators, and Mike's talked us through that in a fair amount of detail already. So how does that apply to human systems? Well, complex causality creates one of the VUCA situations that we talk about when we think about the complex human world. It creates uncertainty, which causes us to try and make predictions in order to control the uncertainty. We try to control the complex systems that we're part of, but which you can't do because everything we do will have unintended consequences. So when we look at causality, we have to think about how might we nudge the system gently into a more desired state, rather than think about huge global solutions which aren't actually going to create the consequences that we want. Thank you, Mike. The second thing that a complexity paradigm offers for us is this idea of a network effect. So we're going to start in that sort of paradigm to look at the relationships between things, events, and actors in order to understand what is going to happen. So in a scientific sense, webs and networks are sitting beneath all of our living systems. So there's a food web up on the left-hand side. Those of you who are familiar with the fungal network that exists in all forest ecosystems, this is the wood wide web, which is pictured on the top right. And I love the bottom one, which is a scientific study into the social networks of dolphins. So if you think we're the only things that have social networks, that's definitely not true. So understanding what networks are at play in any given situation, there are various different categorizations of networks, and the links between actors, the sorts of ties they have, whether they're close and strong or long distance and weak, helps us to understand how a complex issue might play out in a system. How does that affect us again as humans? Well, it creates a load of complexity. We can't just think about individual actors, individual players. We have to think about networks of meaning making, this great quote from the author of The Little Prince. We have to think about the fact that you can't just replace one individual with another. You know, if you're thinking about roles and recruitment, person A managing this team is going to do a very different job from person B, and actually it might affect the whole relational network around that team. The third factor that I want to talk about is emergence. Emergence is a much misused term because people tend to just say, well, it's about things emerging, so our new ideas are emerging. Emergence is a much more specific term than that in the complexity sciences. It's about the fact that at different levels of scale, new order emerges. So because individual actors interact with each other, they form a pattern. Then that pattern interacts back on the actors. And that's what emergence means. It means as you increase the scale of the different entities involved, new phenomena, new order emerges. So for example, if you think about birds in the air, when does a group of birds become a flock? What is the actual identifying characteristic of a flock? Well, it moves together, but you need a certain number of birds, and very specifically, you need birds of the same species in order for a flock to form. If you have a bunch of birds from different species, they don't form a flock. They'll just fly up into the air and go off in different directions because the actors don't know the rules. So how, again, does this apply in the human world? What it does is it creates novelty. So the world is not a predictable place, and every time you change scale, it's possible to think about what's going to happen next, and everything just adds up. New things show up. We need new language to describe different ways of operating. So if you think about all the new language that's come out from the digitally enabled world, it's because we don't have words for the phenomena that show up when people are as connected at the level of scale that we have here. And we often have to think about language from other disciplines, other domains, in order to make sense of new phenomena and new order at different sense of scale. The fourth thing is more about disorder than order, which is this idea of a discontinuity. So sometimes when systems build up and scale increases, we get new order, which is emergence. Sometimes we get the opposite. We get an absolutely sudden discontinuity in what's occurring. And this is a good example, the formation of a tornado. As a wind picks up speed, there's a point at which it starts to spin in on itself, and you get these different weather phenomena. Weather is particularly prone to discontinuities because of the scale of the events that we're talking about. So this is the idea of small change, big difference, and it's particularly associated, unfortunately, these days with environmental collapse. Small changes in an ecosystem can make it look very stable, look like it's surviving, look like it's healthy, and then the whole thing will suddenly collapse. In the reverse case, on the right-hand side, you've got the formation of an algal bloom. Again, lots of small events eventually get to a point where the sea is clogged up with a deoxygenating algae, and everything else in the environment dies. Discontinuities are also things like the emergence of mob behavior suddenly out of a crowd for no obvious apparent reason. And it's all because different feedback loops can amplify against each other and cause a runaway change. So those of you who've thought about climate change and the potential for runaway in that system, that's what's going on here. We can think that something is progressing smoothly, and then all of a sudden there's a tip. So again, human systems, we don't expect volatility. We think things are going to smoothly progress. They're going to carry on as they have before. We use our previous experience. We try to apply best practice, and actually those things are not going to apply in a situation where something discontinuous or abrupt has happened. Those of you who have again been paying attention to the public response to the COVID virus will know that contagion is not just a biochemical event. The contagion of panic, particularly as it tipped over into panic buying in the UK, nobody knew what was the moment that that was going to shift, but it all just shifted in the space of a day. Different networks are more resilient to the idea of a discontinuity, to collapse. And the more tightly coupled a network is, the more prone it is to collapse or contagion. And, you know, there's some argument that the level of contact that people have on social media sometimes actually exacerbates panics and mob behavior. The last thing I just want to draw our attention to, I particularly love this cartoon, is that the new science also takes us towards an understanding that the observer creates an effect. The way that we look at systems, the way that we measure them, actually can create the results that we see. So this came originally from Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, work in the new physics around what is a photon anyway? Is it a wave? Is it a particle? And has also driven a lot of the thinking in deep ecology, which is trying to say, but it's not, the world is not created for humans. If we move away from our anthropocentric perspective and take a mouse's eye view, as this photo on the right is, it would change the way that we thought about ecology and environmental science completely. So the observer principle, I think, will be familiar to a lot of you. We do understand in most organizations that people's reality is subjectively driven. The way that you see the world is based on your viewpoint, and that creates a lot of ambiguity in our systems. Quote from Freud, which is neurosis is the intolerance of ambiguity, I think is a particularly interesting one. So we need to understand what the frames are that people are using to understand their world, understand our organizations. We have to recognize that we don't see the same problems, let alone the same solutions, and that actually conflicting perspectives are a strength. They confer resilience on our meaning making. So there you go, in 13 minutes, some ideas about how complexity science can change our lenses. And then I also, as you will have noticed, if you were paying attention, I was trying to link those back to the 4 words of VUCA plus N for novelty. So discontinuities can create volatility, complex causality creates uncertainty, relational networks can create complexity, paradigms and subjectivity create ambiguity, and emergence creates novelty. So the source of the VUCA-ness of the VUCA world is the complexity of the world. The world was always complex. It's just that we had a bunch of simple models that tried to carve it up, and that kind of blinded us to the fact that actually this is going on all the time. So just for a few moments, go back to the thing that you were thinking about as your complex idea, and think, if I was to take those 5 lenses, can you go back, Mike? Sorry. If I was to take those 5 lenses and think about the issue that I'm paying attention to, what might the idea of discontinuities, of complex causality, of networks, of subjective viewpoints and observer effects and emergence help me think about in relation to the issue that I was paying attention to? And then if we move on, just taking my time, that's why I'm looking. One of the things we have to recognize is that in our managerial and organizational systems, we're still working quite heavily in this linear analytical framework. We think that our organization is made up of structure charts. We don't really think that, but we kind of behave as if it is when we do recruitments and define job roles and try and decide what the human processes are. We sort of know that just because we write a program plan, it doesn't mean that anything's actually going to happen, but we try to forget the complex web of causes and processes that actually take place in a human organization. We think that growth is smooth and unbumpy, and we draw our nice models about how things change and develop. We think that just because we've got a global system, it doesn't mean it's any more complex than a national system, and that there won't be new phenomena emerging just because we've gone up to that level of scale. And we forget that setting organizational objectives from the top down confers a very particular view on the subjectivity of the people involved in that organization. And we think that we see the world from the top in the way that everybody sees it from the rest of the system. So perhaps when you go back to work, just have a little think about, look at all your charts and diagrams and think, am I a bit trapped in this paradigm of linear analytics that actually makes me think my organization, which is a complex web of interacting causality with emergent properties and discontinuities, am I trying to simplify it beyond the point which is useful? And then the last slide, Mike, we all get caught. I love this picture. So coming from a developmental perspective in my career, I really like the idea that linear progression of intellect is a real thing, and that human beings are made up of geometric angles. So I hope that's given you a bit of a provocation. Anyone who's interested in complexity and the impact of complexity on organizational thinking, I strongly recommend this book by Ralph Stacey, who was one of the first people to really talk about the way that we see the world and the way we see our organizations actually drives a lot of our behavior. He's also got a good summary of the complexity sciences and how they might be applied to the organizational system. So we've got a few minutes left. So I'm following on from the lovely example that Julie Allen has given us of using a poem to end our session. So Julie found us a poem, which I think is perfect for thinking about the genuine complexity of the world and how we play with it. And following her lead, I'm going to read it twice. So this is Rainforest by Judith Wright. The forest drips and glows with green. The tree frog croaks his far-off song. His voice is stillness, moss and rain, drunk from the forest ages long. We cannot understand that call unless we move into his dream, where all is one and one is all, and frog and python are the same. We, with our quick, dividing eyes, measure, distinguish, and are gone. The forest burns, the tree frog dies, yet all is one, and one is all. So again, just so you can take in the meaning. Rainforest. The forest drips and glows with green. The tree frog croaks his far-off song. His voice is stillness, moss and rain, drunk from a forest, ages long. We cannot understand that call unless we move into his dream, where all is one and one is all, and frog and python are the same. We, with our quick, dividing eyes, measure, distinguish, and are gone. The forest burns, the tree frog dies, yet one is all, and all are one. So I wish you luck with applying some lenses of the complexity paradigm to your world over the next week or so. And I'll just hand back to Mike to close the session.
Thank you very much, Karen, for that second half. So we'll be back in a week's time, pivoting again to look at relationship resilience this time, and away from the cognitive.